It's in the bookstore. It's called The Boko Haram Doctrine. This gentleman who's doing his PhD at Rice University in the US, I mean, it's quite rare for somebody to be during your PhD, you're already putting out books that are taking the world by storm. He was published first by Hearst Publishers. We actually got Reader Books. We thought it was such an important book that we got the Nigerian rights. If there was, I think it sold for about £30 or something, which would make it about 13,000 naira. So we thought if we do a Nigerian edition, then we can sell it for like maybe 4,000, 4,500, so that everyone can access it. So the author of the Boko Haram I could call you an author, right? Or the editor? And yeah, because I know you did it with a partner as well. Please join me in welcoming Abdul Basit Kasim. And Prof is like a big brother. He's kind of like my moral compass. So when I read his stuff, if I'm not sure what I should be thinking or believing about things that have to do with governance, politics, I just go and read his column, and then he just sets me right, you know? So you probably don't even know this. Join me in welcoming a very important personality, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim.
Hello? Assalamu alaikum, Kaduna. Assalamu alaikum, CaboFest team. Because of want of time and the sensitivity of what we're discussing this afternoon, you will check pages 25 for Professor Jibrin Ibrahim's bio, and also check page 20 for Abdul Basit Kasim's bio. That way we can have ample time to discuss what we're talking about. Now, I'd like to start with a teaser. How many of us here in the audience as participants have ever taken time to watch a caterpillar metamorphose? How many of us? Quite a few. So there's this delicate point where the caterpillar is turning into a beautiful butterfly. And if you tamper with the caterpillar, you destroy the butterfly. For me, that's religious extremism. When you want to tamper with tenets of a religion that have been here before you were, you always make mistakes. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And the caliber of the panelists that I have here, they have in-depth knowledge of what we're going to be talking about. And like Auntie Lola said, Professor Jibrin is like a big brother on this panel, and I would like to start with you, Professor Sir. If you would take us through what religious extremism is, the impact of it in Nigeria.
Good afternoon, all. It's always a pleasure for me to be here. It makes me become younger. I feel rejuvenated because the new generation is writing about our genuine situation. They are brave, not afraid. They are resisting patriarchy and just doing all the right things. So I feel reassured when I come here. My day job is writing about Nigerian politics, which is extremely depressing profession to be in. So to facilitate my entry into CaboFest, I've gone into creative nonfiction, and I invite you all to read my first creative nonfiction, which is what happened here yesterday. Back page of Daily Trust. Advert is finished. We can... Trust are my friends, so I advertise them all the time. Yesterday morning, one of the key conclusions that came out was that, in a sense, we as Nigerians are all mentally deranged. I know Dr. Aisha will contest that because she doesn't want the whole of Nigeria as her patients. But I think very strong points were made yesterday that there's so much trauma in our society, and we are all affected by the terrible situation we find ourselves in. We've been, for a very long time, on a pathway to religious extremism. And I'm a social scientist, so what I want to do in 2 minutes is to describe that pathway. I see 5 or 6 steps we have taken along that pathway. And the first is that Nigeria has become a country of very high religiosity. Those of us who have had a few years know very well that 50 years ago, 40 years ago, Nigerians were not as religious as they are today. Religiosity is used here as a social science concept, which means we spend time, energy, and money on religion. It doesn't mean we are religious. And that's my second point. Nigeria is one of the most irreligious countries in the world today. We all spend our energy and time and money on religion, but we don't believe what we are espousing. We don't at all. We social scientists, we test whether people believe what they are saying. The test for religion is, most Nigerians say they are Christians or Muslims. So we social scientists, we look at what are the values espoused by Christianity and Islam. Peace, love, say no to corruption, no to fornication. What have we had since we've come here? Every family, there are pedophiles. People steal with reckless abandon. People do the exact opposite of exactly what their religions tell them, which means we have made the world history as being the first country in the world to have the highest level of religiosity, as well as having the highest level of irreligiosity, which is the opposite of religiosity. And I think it's really such a feat. And this in itself traumatizes people. The fact that everybody knows he's claiming to be a Christian or a Muslim, but in their daily practice, they are not Christians or Muslims. The third step I want to draw attention to has to do with the nature of the religious arena in this country. Nigeria has one of the most open religious arenas in the world today. That is, in this country, anybody can come to the marketplace and start preaching a creed. There are no tests on whether they are qualified to do that. There's no determination of their capacity to do that. There's no checking to see what they are saying conforms with the religious doctrine they claim to be espousing. And that is always an explosive situation when you have a completely open religious arena. My fourth point is that Nigeria has undergone one of the most profound religious transformation in the world. In one generation, between 30 to 35% of Nigerians have changed their religion. Sufi Muslims have become Wahhabi Muslims, and Orthodox Christians have become Pentecostalists. This is huge. I've been checking the records to see, are there examples of a percentage as high as 30, 35% changing their religion within one generation? It's extremely difficult to find that. And that's the trauma we are facing. The fifth point I want to make has to do with the key issue of religious education and socialization within the family. When people change their religion, as they have done in this country, is the younger generation that has done so, leaving the elder ones in where they previously were. This puts a break in transmission of religious values and religious education from the older members of the family to the younger members of the family. And it is in that vacuum that's created that new religious movements with all sorts of objectives, intentions, and dynamics crop up and play such a big role in society. It is therefore in this context that I think religion became a major vehicle for breeding violence in our society, because more and more members of the society have not been normalized, socialized, educated into the religious values of their parents, and that opens the Pandora's box.
Thank you so very much, Professor Jibrin, for taking your time to give us those few steps on religiosity. And I hope that opens up to us the understanding of the concept of religious extremism. Now, officially in Nigeria, to you, Abdul Basit, officially in Nigeria, it is known that Nigeria has only two religions in Nigeria, Islam.
To answer the question, I would first love to thank Auntie Lola for inviting me for this panel. And I also want to, I feel highly honored actually being on this panel together with Professor Jibril Ibrahim. Before I met him, I've been reading so many articles from him, and being on the same panel with him is such a privilege. Now, going back to your question, are we coming from? The second question, how did we get to where we are now? The third question, where are we going? Now, the first question is about the past. Because wherever we see today actually did not emerge from a vacuum. There's a trajectory, there's a genealogy, and it's important for us to have a conversation about that genealogy, about the past, about what has been happening in this particular region, northern Nigeria. Now, the second question, how did you get here? Now, this is the question of the present. And then the third question, where are we going? That's a societal prognosis. It's the question of the future. Because the present is actually what will define the future. Now, going back to the question of extremism. Extremism is such a politically charged concept. And people use the concept in a different ways. I mean, in some ways, it's used to silence opposition by just calling people extremists. But for me, I actually approach the subject of extremism from the question of group dynamics. Now, all of us in this venue, we all have our markers of distinction. We have what defines us. We have what I call, we all belong to certain in-group. So extremism, the genesis actually starts from this dichotomy of in-group and out-group. Where do you belong? In-group, I am this. I am a Muslim. I am that's in-group. And then you also have, that's the us versus them. That's the genesis. But that is not enough for extremism. Extremism comes in when members of an in-group when they actually feel that their successes and their survival cannot be separated from the need to carry out hostile actions towards the outgroup. So let me take this again. So for example, if I define myself that I am Abdul Basit and I am a Salafi, or I am a Sufi follower, I'm just giving an example. Now, if I see other people who don't share my belief with me, if I see them and just feel, well, they have other belief, I have my own belief. But if I see them and I create a perception that before my own belief can be established, I have to conduct hostile action against other people who actually share different belief, that's the genesis of extremism. Now, going back to the past, some of the things, reality that we actually deal with today, they are things that can be traced. You know, when I started my research on Boko Haram, I was going to different archives, trying to get different texts, historical texts. I mean, I went as far back as 16th century, 17th century. I was looking at the text of the ulamas, of the scholars that came from this region, and I was asking myself, what did they write? How did we get to this place? What did they write about the question of the state? What should be the Muslim position towards the state? Mind you, in the past, this particular region, the Muslims in this region, the Muslims actually had the conception of the division of lands based on Islamic terminology. We have Dar al-Islam, which is the land of Islam, and then Dar al-Kufr, which is that land of unbelief. Colonialism came, it changed that pattern of classifying land. So there was no question of Dar al-Islam that has a caliph, or Dar al-Kufr that is considered an enemy territory. Colonialism changed all of that. Although colonialism changed that, but so many people did not change their understanding. And that's why even up to today, people still feel that we need to revive that Dar al-Islam that used to be, that was actually decimated or destroyed by colonialists. People in this era still have such perception. And it's very important for us to sit down and have that difficult conversation. Now that we don't have this classification of land, how are we going to, we need to have that conversation. And more also, this particular region has been so susceptible to different influences from different parts of the world. At the earlier phase of our development, the influences usually come from the Sahara. Most of the Muslim scholars and most of the scholars in northern Nigeria, they had influences from places like Egypt. We had scholars, people like Abdul Karim al-Maghili. I mean, al-Maghili was coming all the way from, the Sahara. He had influences on scholars in order, there was cultural exchanges. Unfortunately, we become a dumping site where we don't really produce our own original ideas of religion. Rather, we became a dumping site for other theologically trained on certain ways of belief and then come back. So just to add to what Professor Jibril said, there's no any means of checking what people study. There's no any means, we're just a dumping site. People take ideas from different places and they proselytize those ideas in the public sphere. And lastly, what I would also love to touch about is, you know, when I look at the religious milieu, especially in northern Nigeria, I am so startled about the level of changes that have taken place in the religious public sphere. And I think it's important for the followers, I mean, whether we like it or not, all of us in this room, both those who are religious and those who are religious, we have certain people we look up to as scholars, as models, or people who we take knowledge from, whether sacred knowledge or non-sacred knowledge. I think it's very important for the followers to start questioning the people they view as leaders. Why do you hold certain position at a particular time? Why did you change your position at another time? I will give an example to end this conversation here. At the religious preaching in year 2000, he even held the idea at that time that studying Western education was haram. Not only that, he also held the idea that obeying the government is like worshipping other than God. It's like obedience. They call it in Arabic, shirku taha. That's politism of obedience. Today, Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaky is not holding that view again. He is the person today saying that my movement, we are open to everybody. We even have Pastor Yohana Baru as part of our members. So if we have Pastor Yohana Baru as part of our members, you know, why will you call us certain name? And then I ask myself, something has changed from what you preached at that time to what you preach now. So what changed? When I look at the Salafi circle, some of the ulamas in the early 2000s, they were preaching things like democracy was haram, voting al-intikhabat is kufr. They were preaching all of that. The same people who were preaching all those things that at that time, they are now the ministers in the government. And then I asked the question, did the text you were preaching at that time, did it change? Because it's still the same text. Nothing has changed. If the text did not change, then what changed? And then the followers themselves, they are now, most of the followers are now doing intellectual acrobatics. They're trying to make meaning. Malam, GFR, you were teaching this thing. Yo, you know, they're also trying to make sense of the changes. When I look at the Sufi scholars, I also see the same pattern as well. I mean, in the past, most of the Sufi scholars, they are not as pacifist or quietist as we see Sufi scholars today. In the past, they held certain opinion. In the present, they changed this opinion. And that is why I think that religious followers need to be critical with their leaders, need to ask questions. Scholar, sir, why is this issue this way at this time? Why is it? I mean, there was a time when the Izala scholars, for example, I mean, this is what I study as part of my PhD. They held certain opinion. Today, they are the ones that are taking pictures at the Security Council of the United Nations. And I asked myself, okay, Malam, GFR, you were saying Oto is haram. Yo, you are the one taking Oto up and down, like everywhere you're taking pictures, even going to Snap with Masquerade. What changed? Thank you.
I'm still with you, Bassett. You know, this last point you made would I'd take a reference from the book that we're using as a guide in this particular session that we're in, which is about the Boko Haram. Now, Boko Haram, Boko, which is education, and Haram, I don't get the English word for haram. Forbidden, thank you, for forbidden. Education is forbidden. Western education is forbidden. Now, and then we see Boko Haram on YouTube. We see Boko Haram on all the social platforms. So what exactly is Boko Haram up to?
Sorry, if I could just intervene before you come in, because I want to emphasize the point he made about the difficulty of defining the religious extremists. 2 months ago, I attended the conference on extremism in the Sahel. It was in Niamey. And one of the main purposes of the conference was to review a major study done of terrorists, religious terrorists that have been captured in Mali. And a number of social scientists sat with them to find out what they are, what they believed in. And it was very interesting. I've described the pathway towards the rise of Pentecostalism and Wahhabism, Salafism in Nigeria. And that was one of the main questions they were trying to research. And what they find is that almost all of them had very poor religious education. They didn't know the basic tenets of Islam. They couldn't tell the difference between Sufi Islam and Wahhabi Islam. So their engagement couldn't have been as religious extremists because they knew very little about that religion. The second question, therefore, that was posed was, well, if you are really so poor in religion, why do you do it? And the big answer was, I was given a sense of belonging to a community that takes care of us. They get us a wife, they give us a basis for livelihood, they give us a source of living, and they take care of us, and they protect us against this wicked state that is always trying to do us harm. The second example I want to draw was the research done this time on Boko Haram in Nigeria by the late Abdurrahman Mustafa. Rafu objected to this idea of interviewing prisoners because there are ethical questions. Are they free to say what they really believe in? So in his own study, what he did was to get a list of Boko Haram members and fighters, and then trace them back to family and peer group, and find out from family and peer group, why did he enter? And again, the result was identical. They were not religious zealots. They had not in their lives up to when they joined that shown any specific interest in religion, but that was a community that offered them an alternative to the wicked, corrupt Nigerian state which needed to be destroyed.
Thank you so much. So in addition to what Professor Jibril Ibrahim said, you know, what Professor Jibril Ibrahim said is actually in the literature, we call it like the structural factors of radicalization. Yeah. The structural factors. Those factors that Professor Jibril said, they're very, very important factors, and they should never be undermined. But personally, I actually believe that religion is very, very important, and I will give the reason. Before 2009, I mean, I personally myself, the type of approach I take when studying any movement in general, whether religious or non-religious movements, I use what in philosophy they call phenomenology. So phenomenology was developed by Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger. So they actually believe that for you to study, so for example, if I have to study rape, I have to imagine a subjective experience of being someone who was raped in order to understand. Most times when we discuss this issue of extremism, we sometimes use our own worldview or what we think about the world to analyze other people. For me, I try to understand the subjective experience of this person. What was he studying? What was he preaching? And I actually started by, I gathered all the primary source materials of Boko Haram, their books. I mean, Boko Haram actually published books. They are not, when people say they are ignorant of Islam, I tend to disagree. They know what they're saying. They publish Arabic books. I mean, they even have a publishing press, Maktabatu Wadiyu Bayan. Maktabatu Wadiyu Bayan publishes books of Shekau. They publish, in fact, just 2 months ago, 2 months ago, he has one book, Risalat Man al-Fil Islam. I mean, they write books. But not only books, they also deliver lectures as well. And when you sit down and listen to the lectures, some of the lectures are on YouTube. They are still there on YouTube. Muhammad Yusuf was not ignorant. He might not have been literate in English, but he knows the sources. He cites books of history. Some of those books, in fact, personally myself, I've always been hearing about Umar Mukhtar, the Lion of the Desert. I never had a complete knowledge of Umar Mukhtar except when I listened to Muhammad Yusuf. It was from Muhammad Yusuf I knew what happened. And he cited texts. I had to go and verify those texts, and it was correct. So he actually knows what he's preaching. So for me, I try to look at all those readings, and then I try to make sense. What exactly are they preaching? And I think it's important for us to take ourselves away from our world and try to get into the world of the people we want to study. Like, why is Muhammad Yusuf holding this view? I always say, Muhammad Yusuf was not the first person to preach that Boko is Haram. Muhammad Yusuf was not, virtually, with the exception of takfir, with the exception of excommunication of other Muslims, which became so extreme in Boko Haram ideology. I mean, Boko Haram even had to kill one of their own leaders. Mama Noor was killed by Boko Haram members. With the exception of extreme takfir, everything that Boko Haram said, so many scholars in northern Nigerian history have said it before him. So many scholars have said it. And if you look at their text, I mean, you see all of these discourses there. And I think it's very important to also have that conversation. Mohammed Yusuf, Boko Haram should not be singled out as, oh, this group is the group that actually brought extremism, quote and unquote. Before them, we've had people who were preaching the same thing, the same opinion, the same values. Those things are documented in text. So to conclude, one of the ways I believe, because if you interview Boko Haram members in the prison, they are under duress and coercion. In fact, in one of the videos of Shekau actually said that his members, they trained his members on the rehearsed answers they should give if they have been in prison. If they ask you this question in prison, these are the answers you should give them. So they won't suffer you in the prison. So if you interview them in prison, they are under duress. But if you interview them where they are free with themselves, you will see that what they are doing, you might see it as being as a wrong deed, but they are committed to it because they actually believe that this is the only way to create an antidote or remedy to what they consider a societal dystopia. Because they all already see the society as this society is already going, you know, it has departed from what it used to be. There's no more Islamic states. There's no more, people are not ruling with the Sharia again. They're not ruling with Qawanin Wadaiya. They're not ruling with Dustur. They're not ruling with all of these secular constitutions. We used to have Sharia before. We used to have Kanem Borno. We used to have Shokoto Caliphate. We used to have all of this. All of this is gone. Muhammad Yusuf was telling his followers all of this. And these are facts. They are facts that we need to talk about. So, I mean, for him, we should not just see them as people who are irrational. They are rational. They know what they're doing. What they're doing might not necessarily, it's a wrong deed. I mean, the killing, nobody can justify such things. But they're doing it with a zeal that they want to bring a Puritan or pristine, quote and unquote. They want to revive an heritage that has been destroyed. And they also believe that what they're doing, they might not get the reward in this life, but the reward is actually there in the hereafter for them. And some of those teachings, I mean, if you look at our history and even some of the religious texts, you will see them there. So I think most times when we have this conversation, we sometimes just go to periphery, like without necessarily going to the core and uncovering and unearthing that conversation. No matter how funny it is, we should discuss it. Thank you.
Okay, Abdul Basit, I'm still with you. You talked about how well Boko Haram means for whatever it is doing. But you will all agree with me that the common man on the street doesn't understand that Boko Haram, or all this knowledge that you're sharing with us, that Boko Haram means well. And no. So how do you get, well, how do you get the market woman who sells aleho, who sells tomatoes or carries yams on her head, or a victim whose house was bombed and destroyed by the same group of people, to understand what you just said?
Thank you. Let me just correct let me correct what you said. Okay. What I'm trying to say, and it's very, very important for people not to get me wrong. What I'm trying to say is for us to have a good, I pay more attention to understanding. For us to understand, we have to understand how people think and what made people to get to where they are. Some of those issues, they are structural issues, like what Professor Jibril Ibrahim said. It might be poverty. It might be the fact that your family were killed by the Nigerian military and you became sympathetic to, it might even be coercion. There are cases where young boys have been conscripted to Boko Haram. It might be all of those factors. But I am saying that religion is also a factor. And for us to understand, we need to drop our thinking and go into the worldview of the people we want to understand. So, going back, I mean, honestly, they've perpetrated so many atrocities that can never be justified, even no matter how you twist Islamic theology. Some of those atrocities they perpetrated cannot be justified. But the question is, why do they do it? They do it as a means to an end. what is that end for them? They believe that if they don't do some of those type of actions, so Muhammad Yusuf actually, let me go back to the founder himself. Muhammad Yusuf was saying that you Muslims of northern Nigeria, this is not the way your forefathers used to be. In the past, your forefathers were implementing the Quran. They were not implementing secular constitutions. Today, the Quran is no longer the canon. It's not what people used to judge. The Hadith is not what people used to judge. That is what Muhammad Yusuf was actually saying. Muhammad Yusuf also was saying that you have all tried different means of reviving this heritage. You've gone to democracy, you failed. Some of you went into activism like Zegzeki, you failed. Then Muhammad Yusuf said the only path, the only methodology that can bring back that revive a pristine heritage, quote unquote, is by confrontation with the secular state. The secular state has to be fought. And Muhammad Yusuf even mentioned that the secular state has to be fought, the military also has to be fought, because they are the ones providing the defensive mechanism for the state. Muhammad Yusuf listed the people that should be fought. In the beginning, they were not targeting Christians, because that was not, but later, because another thing with extremism is the enemy of my enemy becomes your enemy. So as the time progresses, they felt like, well, this community, they are providing support to their adversary, therefore they are also an enemy. They start fighting. So all in all, I think what is very important, and that was what that was the major motive of writing the Boko Haram Reader. Because when I started research on Boko Haram, I noticed that so many people were citing, oh, it's because of poverty. And then I asked the question, Nigeria is not the poorest country in Africa. There's so many poor African countries. Why has this insurgency, why has it not started there as well? So people and I noticed that many people were relying on secondary sources, whether what the journalists actually report. But for me, I'm like, wait, let us go to the core. Muhammad Yusuf was preaching. He was on radio station. He was on different campuses. What was he preaching? Shekau was preaching. In fact, in one of the preaching of Shekau was saying, somebody asked him the question you asked me earlier, that Malam, why will you say Boko Haram when we are using electricity? We are using electricity, we are using, look at restore, everything is from Boko. Then Shekau was saying that it's not the Boko that we are against. Shekau and Muhammad Yusuf, they actually listed 3 forms of Western education. And they said, the first form, whatever in Western education conflicts with Islamic theology, it should not be studied. And they gave example of Charles Darwin. I mean, Muhammad Yusuf knows Charles Darwin. So when people say he's ignorant, I'm like, no, he's not. If somebody who is in Kaduna State, who barely had access to internet, knows Charles Darwin, he knows something. And then the second thing, they actually said that whatever does not contradict the Quran, then it can be studied. And Muhammad Yusuf said, he said, look at our schools. He said, look at Marcus Ibn Taymiyyah, look at Marcus Abu Hurairah, Marcus Salafiyah. In these places, we also teach some of the, it's not only religion we teach. This is what Muhammad Yusuf is saying. I want you to understand, this is, don't get me wrong, like this is what he's saying. And then the last form of knowledge, he said, whatever does not contradict the Quran or the Sunnah, he said whatever does not contradict the Quran or the Sunnah can be studied. But he said what is not clear, whether it contradicts or not, the scholars should decide whether people should study it or not. So in essence, when people say Boko Haram is against Western education, I always say no. Boko Haram is not against entirety of Western education. They are against the type of curriculum, this type of study. Muhammad Yusuf will ask, why are you teaching Aristotle and Plato? What you can teach about Abdul Qadir Mustafa Dantafa, who was also a philosopher. So they are asking that, why will you study Durkheim? Muhammad Yusuf mentioned Durkheim in his Aziyakidatina. In his book, Aziyakidatina, which was about 3 volumes. Volume 1 was published in 2006. Volume 2 was published in 2009. Volume 3 was published in 2015 by his son, Abu Musa Barnawi. In those 3 volumes, Muhammad Yusuf mentioned Durkheim. So he's not ignorant. So they are saying, why will you study Durkheim when you can't study Ibn Khaldun? So these are some of their arguments. So, and I think what we've always been missing in conclusion is you cannot say you want to defeat something you've not even taken your time to sit down and understand. that first step of understanding, unfortunately, for the past 10 years, we are still failing at it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Abdul Basit. Back to you, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim. Unfortunately, religious extremism has done more harm from both the Christian and the Islamic religion. It has done more harm than any good to us as a people and as a nation.
Respond to two issues that my good friend has raised. On Durkheim, I happen to have done my doctorate at the university where Durkheim wrote his book on secularization. And we had to do a lot of reading of Durkheim. I think there are two interesting things Durkheim did in his work on secularization. One is secularization as an ideology. That this is a set of belief. You are in an age of science, therefore, science should guide your conception of the cosmology. But the second issue is social transformation, which is to say that when certain things happen to certain societies, people move away, essentially, or a majority of the people move away from the path of religion because so many other things occupy their mind. So it may not be an ideological thing. And I'm raising this Durkheim example in terms of the two things we said which appear to be in conflict, but which are the same. I made the point that when you interview a lot of the militants of this organization, they know very little about Islam, and that's a fact. Your point is, but their leaders do. Their leaders have studied profoundly, they've read, they have written books. And I think both things are correct, which refers to the whole issue of what happens when revolutions occur in history. You have a leadership that's, for instance, very well groomed in Marxism, and know all the theory and argue it out, but most of their followers have not mastered the doctrine and have very peripheral understanding of what is happening. And I think it's extremely important to always tie these two trends about what leadership knows and does and what followers or members of the community know and do. But I think the problem with religion, to come back to your question, is that there's a sense in which when existence is extremely difficult, when people are faced with huge challenges, religion is the only thing that gives them comfort, that gives them a sense of direction, and that above all assures them, even if things are difficult today, at the end of the day, we are going to transit, and that transition will be to a greater destination. In that sense, religion is always extremely important to society. It's very important to individuals. But the problem with religion is really how you understand and imbibe its values. And the challenge I've pointed out in terms of our situation in Nigeria is the very weak evolution of religious education for the factors that I've already cited. So people begin to mouth a religion they don't have a significant understanding of. We've had all sorts of horror stories over the past 2 days about what religious people in quote, nobody who understands this religion will do that. So we are on a way in which